So for more on Florida's recovery efforts, let's bring in Dennis Smith. He is the planner in residence at Florida State University's Department of Urban and Regional Planning. And you have some experience when it comes to emergency management for the state. So you know exactly what officials are going through now and the options that they are considering. But let us start with sort of a bit of a baseline. What are the challenges for building in places like Florida and also, you know, those barrier islands?
Right. That's a great question. I mean, barrier islands have the name barrier for a reason. They form a barrier to the ocean, but also to the forces of hurricanes, right? So there's kind of three big challenges about building on barrier islands. And the first is just geographic, where they're located. You know, they're very low lying. They are a system that is basically built from shifting sand. So we don't see it every day, but barrier islands are mobile. There's also economic challenges for building on barrier islands. As you can imagine, it's hard to get stuff out there. It's hard to build initially. And then after a disaster, I mean, you can see the damages that are shown on your screen. It's just devastating. So there's the potential for incredible loss, and then challenges with insuring those properties, right? I mean, we need to have insurance in order to have a stable building market. And when we have events like this, it really stresses the insurance industry. And I guess the third consideration is social. Really two areas. One is that it's hard to address the needs of our really socially vulnerable population. So while a lot of people were able to voluntarily evacuate from some of the hardest hit areas, and many people complied with the evacuation order, some didn't. And some didn't because they were potentially elderly or underserved communities that weren't tied into, you know, the kind of media that you and I are able to access. So those are some significant challenges. And I guess the broader challenge is that people like to live along the coast, right? We have had, you know, remarkable growth in Florida. 40% of Americans live along the coast. And, you know, it's a place we want to be. So that's kind of a countervailing challenge, that we want to locate ourselves in an area that is potentially vulnerable to storms just like this.
So then I have two questions for you. You know, I look at some of the images from the barrier islands, Fort Myers, and those homes are elevated. They're up to code, and they're not there anymore. You can see the elevation, the house is gone. Is there even a point to rebuilding on this sort of slip of land that, as you point, sort of naturally would have been moving kind of up and down the coast? It doesn't move because now it has buildings on it. Should we be rebuilding on barrier islands? They're very expensive homes there.
Right. And so you've touched on a great point, and that is, when we have a disaster like this, we all chip in. The whole nation chips in to cover the costs of that expense, right? And you know, I don't want to take away from any of the damages that occurred here in Florida, but we do have to rethink how we rebuild. And there are ways to think about this progressively, where, you know, we don't kill our building market, you know, our housing market, but we think about climate adaptation, where we can, you know, maybe sacrifice some of our sandy beach for mangroves and start some replanting. We can rebuild potentially behind a dune line, which would afford some natural protection. So there are some methods that are short of just not rebuilding. But when some of this land does become available for redevelopment after these storms, as a community, we need to think about, do we set that aside to be a national park, let's say, or a state park, so that we can take some of this land that's particularly vulnerable out of this stream of kind of disaster, rebuild, that cycle. We need to break that cycle.
And when we're talking about extreme weather now, should we also consider that there are areas that were not considered vulnerable before that are now vulnerable? And we have to think of that when we move forward?
You know, that's a great question. I think we're very familiar now with the potential impacts of climate change, right? This is a slow-moving disaster that we're going to be facing really over the next 100 years. And we have really good analytical tools to let us know, you know, what the flood inundation might look like in 20 years and 40 years and 60 years. So when we do things like build a road or something that's going to be around for a while, or we're thinking about, do we want to buy out some properties and turn them into a park? we should consider what those models say, because this kind of impending threat of continued sea level rise is going to be with us. It's going to be something we're going to need to work with.
Yeah. Dennis Smith, I could probably talk to you all day long, but thanks for spending some time with us.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And really, my heart goes out to all those folks that were affected by this storm. It's never easy. I've done this for 30 years, and, my heart breaks for those who are impacted. And it goes out to all those first responders who are out there, right now, helping make things better. So thanks for having me.
Thank you.